The rain in the Magdalena Valley doesn't wash things clean. It just presses the heat down into the earth until the ground feels like it is breathing. It was 3 in the morning. The air inside the safe house was heavy, not with humidity, but with a silence so thick you could choke on it. The kind of silence usually comes right before a bomb goes off. 5 men stood in the room. They were hardened men, men who had killed for land, for money, for sport. They were holding rifles, but their knuckles were white. They weren't looking at the door. They weren't looking at the windows. They were looking at the man sitting in the leather chair in the center of the room. He wasn't shouting. He wasn't pacing. He wasn't making threats. He was peeling an orange. Slowly, methodically, the rind coming off in one long, unbroken spiral. The man across the desk, a guerrilla commander named Luis, swallowed hard. The sound was audible in the quiet room. Luis had sent the letter 3 days ago, a demand, a tax, a requirement that the man in the chair pay for the protection of his roots through the jungle. Luis had expected anger. He had expected negotiation. He had expected a counteroffer. He did not expect this. He did not expect to be invited here, to this farmhouse in the middle of nowhere, with no guards visible outside, just the man in the chair, peeling fruit. "You asked for 12 million pesos, the man in the chair said, finally. His voice was soft, almost gentle. It sounded like a father disappointed in a child's report card. "It is the revolutionary tax," Luis stammered, his grip on his rifle sweating. "For the cause, everyone pays." The man looked up. His eyes were dark, flat, and completely empty of fear. "Everyone pays," he repeated. He placed a slice of the orange into his mouth. He chewed slowly. He swallowed. "But I am not everyone." He stood up. He didn't reach for a gun. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a cassette tape. He placed it on the desk. "You want my money, Luis. That is business. I understand business. But you made a mistake. You didn't just ask for money. You threatened my family if I didn't pay." The thunder rolled outside, shaking the glass in the window frames. The lights flickered. "I do not pay for safety," the man said. His voice dropped an octave, vibrating in the chests of the men standing around him. "I own safety." He pressed play on the recorder. Static hissed through the room. Then a voice, a woman's voice, crying, begging. But it wasn't the man's wife. It wasn't his sister. Luis's face went pale. The rifle barrel dipped. It was Luis's own mother. "She is comfortable," the man said, walking around the desk, moving into Luis's personal space until he could smell the gorilla's fear, acrid and sour. "She is having tea in a house I own in Envigado. She thinks you are a successful businessman. She is very proud of you." The man leaned in close. "Do you want her to stay proud, Luis?" Luis couldn't speak. He couldn't breathe. The extortionist had become the hostage. The predator had walked into the cage of a much larger beast.
"You tried to sell me fear," the man whispered. "But you forgot to check the inventory. I have plenty." If you're drawn to the untold stories of power, betrayal, and men who rule through fear rather than noise, you're already in the right place. This is Escobar History Files. Subscribe and tell us in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is right now. What happened in that room was not recorded in the police files in Bogota. It was not written about in the newspapers that circulated the next morning in Medellín. History tells us that Pablo Escobar was a drug trafficker, that he was a bandit, that he was a man who loved money above all else. That is the lie they teach you to keep the world making sense. The truth is much darker. Pablo Escobar did not care about money. Money was paper. Money was a byproduct. Pablo Escobar dealt in a currency much more volatile and much more permanent. He dealt in absolute control. And on the day the M19 guerrillas decided to target him and his partners, thinking they were just rich criminals who would pay to make the problem go away, they made a fatal miscalculation. They thought they were kidnapping the family members of businessmen. They didn't know they were waking up a war machine that would drown Colombia in blood for a decade. This is the story of the day the extortionist learned that you do not tax the devil, you do not threaten the king, and you never, ever make Pablo Escobar wait. To understand the violence that was about to be unleashed, you have to understand the silence that came before it. Colombia is fracturing. On one side, the state, weak, corrupt, bureaucratic. On the other, the guerrillas, the M19, Marxists, idealists with machine guns. They lived in the jungle, but they fed on the cities. They funded their revolution by kidnapping the wealthy. For years, it worked. The cattle ranchers paid, the emerald barons paid, the politicians paid. It was a transaction. You pay the ransom, you get your son back. You pay the tax, they don't burn your farm. It was the cost of doing business. But in the shadows of Medellín, a new class of businessman was rising. They didn't have old money. They didn't have family crests. They had laboratories in the rainforest and airplanes that flew below the radar. They were the extortionables, the narcos. And they were feeling the pressure. You have to imagine the isolation. You are making millions of dollars a day, but you cannot call the police if someone steals from you. You cannot go to court if someone breaches a contract. You are completely outside the law. Paranoia becomes your only friend. Every car parked too long on the street is a surveillance team. Every phone call that clicks is a wiretap. Every glance from a waiter is an assassin checking your face against a photograph. Pablo felt this pressure more than anyone. He wasn't just building a business, he was building an empire. And empires are fragile things at the start. He knew that if he showed weakness just once, it would be over. If he paid a ransom, he would be paying ransoms forever. If he let a guerrilla commander dictate terms to him, he was no longer the boss, he was an employee. And Pablo Escobar worked for no one. The moment that changed everything started innocently. A party at the University of Antioquia. Martha Nieves Ochoa, the sister of the Ochoa brothers, Pablo's partners, his equals. She wasn't a criminal. She was a student. She was innocent.
The M19 grabbed her. They took her into the mountains. They sent a communique. They demanded $12 million for her release. The Ochoas expected the Ochoas to panic. They expected the check to be written within 24 hours. The Ochoas were terrified. They were ready to pay. They went to Pablo. "We have to get her back," Jorge Ochoa said. "We have the money. It's nothing to us." Pablo sat in silence. He looked at the brothers. He looked at the fear in their eyes. He saw the crack in the foundation of everything they had built. If the Ochoas paid, then the guerrillas would come for Pablo's son next, then his wife, then his mother. "No," Pablo said. The room went quiet. "We do not pay," Pablo said, his voice dropping to that dangerous whisper. "If you pay them $1, you are funding the bullets they will use to shoot us next week." "But it is my sister," Jorge pleaded. "And she is my responsibility now," Pablo replied. He stood up. He walked to the window. He looked out over the city of Medellín, a city he considered his personal property. "Call a meeting," Pablo said. "Not with the lawyers, not with the bankers. Call everyone, the assassins, the route commanders, the pilots, the chemists, everyone." "What are we going to do?" Jorge asked. Pablo turned back. A small, cold smile touched his lips. "We will form a union."
It was a psychological masterstroke. Pablo didn't just send hitmen into the jungle, he turned the entire population of Colombia into his eyes and ears. He offered rewards that a peasant farmer couldn't earn in 10 lifetimes just for pointing a finger at a guerrilla safehouse. The hunters became the prey. In the mountains, the M19 commanders felt the shift. Suddenly, the villagers who used to give them food were looking at them differently. The silence of the jungle felt hostile. Supplies stopped arriving. Safe houses were raided, not by police, but by men in black masks who left no survivors. Bodies began to appear on the roadsides. Not innocent people, guerrillas. Hanging from trees, signs around their necks. "I tried to kidnap, now I pay." Pablo stayed in Medellín. He didn't fire a shot. He didn't trek through the mud. He sat in his office. He answered the phone. He listened. "We found another cell, Patron." "Good," Pablo would say. "Make sure the message is clear." The pressure on the M19 was suffocating. They had demanded $12 million. Now they were losing men by the dozen every day. Their infrastructure was crumbling. Their funding was cut off. The fear was shifting. It traveled down the mountain, through the valleys, and settled right into the bones of the guerrilla commanders. Luis, the man who had sent the demand, now was sleeping with a grenade in his hand. He realized too late that he wasn't fighting a government. Governments have rules. Governments have bureaucracy. He was fighting a man who treated Colombia like a chessboard, and he had just moved his queen. 56 days. That's how long it took. 56 days of terror. 56 days where the M19 couldn't sleep, couldn't eat, couldn't move without wondering if the man next to them had sold them out for Pablo's gold. The phone rang in the Ochoa household. It wasn't a demand, it wasn't a threat, it was a surrender. "We will leave her," the voice said. "Just stop. Please, stop the hunting." They left Marta Nieves Ochoa in a ditch near a road. Not 1 peso was paid, but the price had been paid in blood. When the news broke, the city cheered. Pablo Escobar was a hero. He had done what the government couldn't do. He had protected his own. But those close to him saw something else. They saw the change in his eyes. Before Mas, Pablo was a smuggler. He was a man who moved product from point A to point B. After Mas, he was a warlord. He realized that he had an army. He realized that with enough fear and enough money, he could bend the reality of the country to his will. He realized that the state was weak and he was strong. This victory was the beginning of the end. Because once you taste that kind of power, the power to raise armies, the power to drop leaflets from the sky, the power to make hardened revolutionaries beg for mercy, you cannot go back to being just a businessman. The M19 kidnapping didn't destroy Pablo. It created the monster that would eventually consume him. He had paid them in their own fear, but he had also bought himself a new enemy. The world was watching now. The Americans were watching. They saw the private army. They saw the coordination. They saw the threat. And quietly, in offices in Washington and Bogotá, they began to prepare their own hunters. The silence returned to the hacienda. But it was different now. It wasn't the silence of peace. It was the silence of a held breath. Pablo sat in the same chair. The orange peel lay on the desk, dried and curled. He had won, but in winning he had shown his hand.
He had shown the world exactly how dangerous he could be. Power is a strange thing. Men spend their whole lives chasing it. They kill for it. They die for it. But power is not a sword you hold. It is a weight you carry. And on that day, as the rain fell over the valley, Pablo Escobar picked up the heaviest weight of all. He proved that he was untouchable by the laws of men. But he forgot that when you place yourself above the law, you also place yourself beyond its protection. He taught his enemies that the only currency that matters is fear. And eventually, years later, on a rooftop in Medellín, with no shoes on his feet and nowhere left to run, that currency would finally come due. This is Escobar History Files. Subscribe for the stories history tried to bury.